Peter Robinson, and over there we've got Joshua Fernandez. Joshua, can you come into? You're going to have to be careful. Yeah, you're probably in screen. So this is good. So Joshua, please introduce yourself. What are you going to talk about today?
G'day. So I'm going to do a quick talk on Ethereum Fastsync.
Yeah, you go to the next slide so people can see when they maybe.
Right. Okay. Yeah, so we're going to do a run through of how things work at a low level, at a very, very high overview of that. But then going to do a quick talk on Fastsync, and then we're going to compare and contrast that to Fastsync. And then we'll talk about some limitations and what other sync algorithms are out there, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Okay, that sounds good. We'll hope to have lots of curly questions for you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And if anyone wants to, they can fire questions through on the YouTube chat. We'll be watching that too. All right. Thank you. We'll be ready in about another 10 minutes.
Ready to
I think I did unintentionally put it on. Sorry. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I didn't realize that thing actually could pick up from over here.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the moment it's.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, but we'll narrow it in soon because otherwise.
So where should I be standing? About there.
Well, what will happen is that we'll zoom the video in. That actually might even move it across a bit.
Live?
Yeah, this is live. That's YouTube.
Yeah, but adjusting where you shoot.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's a pretty fancy camera, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's nice.
Yeah, it is. And the thing is, we got this at about $550. But now, if you want to get one, it's about $850.
All set for your summit next week? Next week?
Yes, next week it is. Got to be careful. It's still the audio on the computer that I'm monitoring the live stream on. Yeah, we're almost at 90 attendees registered, and so my hope is.
He's just trying to break 100.
Yeah, I want to break that. I think if we get
I can't
100
registration anymore myself.
No.
Especially
But,
that's $40.
It's pretty good for a paid event for the first year.
Yeah.
And having an acceptance rate down around 50% was pretty good. So overall, you gotta be pretty happy with it. First year conference.
And we've got people.
You can't get much better than that.
We've got people coming from India, from Hong Kong, from Victoria, from New South Wales. We've got people from food, from manufacturing, electronics, from clothing. We've got supply chain logistics people. We've got finance. We've got law. We've got government IT.
But not only do we have people coming from Hong Kong and India, we also have people coming from Sydney and Melbourne, and that's a big reason.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, that is
although this time of year, in the Microsoft space, and when they had Tech Ed on the Gold Coast, everyone from Sydney and Melbourne really wanted to come up here. Like when it was August, let's get away from the cold, or blah blah blah. They changed it to Ignite in November, so it's still popular.
Yeah. So it's.
I don't mind weather here in November personally.
The Sydney people liked August in particular because, or Melbourne people.
Yeah, it's terrible in August.
Coming up.
Yeah.
My kids both live in Canberra, and they enjoy being home.
Yeah, 3 p.m. If you put washing on a line or something, it's damp and
It's been like the last week here.
Yeah, it has been very strange. We don't normally get a Mediterranean climate here. It should be dry and not too bad.
Yeah, it's been different. I guess we all have to be used to climate change.
Well, I've lived here most of my life, and I recall at high school back in sort of early 70s, mid 70s, a friend saying to me, "Oh, today it's going to get over 20 degrees." And I remember being impacted in the context that yes, it'd been a long time before we had a day temperature get above 20. But now it's so common. We get only a little bit around August.
It's true.
And our summer's definitely hanging around later to what I recall as a child.
Yeah. Winters are certainly. I mean, I've lived here for 24 years on and winters are definitely much more mild than they used to be.
The other thing that we don't get as much of is, I recall there in summer, you get about sort of 3 o'clock or so, and then boom, you have your thunderstorm, about an hour or so,
Yeah.
that's over. And
Yeah.
then that was, you know, not every day, but you know, quite a few
Yeah, it
days,
was a
many
monsoon
days.
storm.
These weird weeks of mist, it's, you know, like the good English weather, that just never used to happen. I don't
Yes.
recall that happening.
Can't say I noticed that the frequency of mist or foggy type mornings to be more or less frequent than what I recall as a kid.
But we used to get the more tropical storms that would just
Yeah,
come in and be
those-
done, like Peter
yeah.
said.
The afternoon break, as in it would
Yeah.
thing, and you might, if it's too quick, it's just end up with high humidity and so on. But then,
Hello, David Hardage. So thanks very much for the webinars on
Oh,
the
no problem at all.
supply conference. So,
Yeah.
so they're interesting.
Yeah, it's good. Having an active audience or people actually on the line is good. Yeah, because certainly means that, you know, it keeps people on their toes, makes people think. You know. Yeah.
It was interesting on the first one, the beef ledger one. I asked the question because it was talked about quality, and it's like, yeah, that was MSA, and then when I raised it, talked about the quality being all the stuff that was going on beforehand.
Well, and this is the thing. When you posed the question, I was there. I was thinking, he sort of answered it, he sort of hasn't.
No,
But
not really,
I'm hoping that at the conference itself, you know, we will be more shaking out. How does it really work? You know, what value am I actually getting by having blockchain involved in this whole thing?
Yeah.
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 And I think that's something which I'm hoping we'll get, because I know when we look at what our technology actually provides and what it can give, you know, there are some things that I think it does well, and I mean, it's all incremental, you know, like each piece of it gives you incrementally better technology than what you've currently got. But I'm not sure that there's anything which is, you know, like any one little item which is dramatically better. I think like the distributed database between people who don't trust each other, and I think our technology where you've got ephemeral, you know, like the blockchain doesn't need to live forever, I think that's pretty good. And I think the cross-chain stuff is required to give you ephemeral, so that you do something on a blockchain, on a side chain, and then you can, you know, like you finish off doing whatever you're going to do, you find the result across.
Well, you know, I just reviewed this paper for whatever it was, the Journal of International Business Applications, or whatever the hell journal is. All these journals are desperately looking for people who can review blockchain-related papers because they don't have enough qualified reviewers. And so I normally don't review business journal papers, but I got asked to by the editor. And it was a super relevant paper, all about the application of blockchains for supply chain problems in ports around the world. And they had done this sort of survey of 20 ports. And it was an interesting paper, very relevant. I mean, unfortunately, of course, it was blind review, so I don't know who the authors were. It would be unethical for me to show it to you.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not published yet, it's not going through full peer review. But I'd love to be able to say, hey, look, go talk to these guys. But I've got to wait a few weeks until I find out who they are. Let it clear quarantine.
Well, I've heard a couple of mentions of ports. But it's going back to the question, where's blockchain fitting other than everybody talking to each other?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, well, this is what this paper did, is it categorized these kind of efforts into the kinds of applications and imports that made sense for blockchain applications. Right? And it was a useful paper. It'll be interesting to have come out. And I think I have reason to believe they might be in Australia. So.
There is one in Australia. going around. So
Port Brisbane.
more Brisbane and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I work for the state government. We audit the ports.
Oh, right.
We audit Gladstone Port Corporation. It's a government-owned corporation.
Yeah, well, sorry,
Not that I know what's going on. They've got some records to pick up when it's got although it's sold, essentially it's sold Port of Brisbane itself. The other ports sort of work together.
So Port Brisbane is separate from the way the ports work elsewhere in Queensland?
It's separately owned on 99 years. So it's essentially run by a private sector group,
Okay.
consortium, and the others are state government.
Is that airport and shipping port both?
Separate.
Separate.
So the airport is also being sold, that was Commonwealth owned, and that's something was sold.
I recognize all
So they're being privatised. New South Wales is also privatised. A lot of Victoria's got something yet, so we, the state government, run through what they call government business enterprise, government corporation, Gladstone,
I've been in and out of the queue on those offices. Dive supervisor. Back in ports in a maritime context.
Well, yeah, they're supposed to be sort of private sector run, or private sector principles. But the government owns the shares, and the minister gets the board members.
I'm sure that was everyone as well as everyone compromised.
Oh yeah, especially with the Labor government and heavily unionised.
All right. Hello and welcome everyone. So it's good to see everyone today. And today we're going to hear Joshua Fernandez telling us all about Fastsync. And I've been reliably informed by multiple people that it's one of those things that you think you know about. You think, yeah, how hard can it be? We're just syncing the blockchain a little bit faster, a bit of optimization. But I've been reliably informed that I know nothing. You know, what is it, Jon Snow and all that? You know nothing. I'm not doing the accent right. There's someone else can have it.
So good afternoon everybody and welcome to the Ethereum meetup. So my name is Josh and I'm doing a quick presentation on Fastsync. So the very first thing we talk about is synchronization. So basically if you're going to start developing applications or coding transactions or anything on the blockchain, you have to get the current state of the blockchain onto your local node or network or whatever you're doing. Essentially this is called synchronization. So before we get into the guts of it, I'll have a very brief sort of segue as to how the architecture looks like. So at a high level, it can be looked at 3 levels, and I'll walk through them in sequence. So the first is the P2P network itself. So this is responsible for the discovery part of the protocol, finding new peers, initiating connections with them, negotiation of capabilities between peers. So peers can run any number of subprotocols. So things like ETH, Light, Whisper, and so on. The ones we really care about are the ETH subprotocol, and the negotiation of capabilities can be thought of as very much akin to an SSL handshake. So basically the highest secure version that's common to both peers is then taken and then used from that point. So above this comes the ETH protocol manager, and as the name suggests, is specific just to the ETH subprotocol. This handles things like all the default behavior of the ETH subprotocol. So, for example, when you join onto the network, the first message that you've got to send out is a status message. It also looks for when other peers request data from your node. It serves those up. It also provides utilities for querying of data on the ETH subprotocol, and this is used by the synchronizer, which is the next level above. Right, so as the name suggests, the synchronizer is the bit that's responsible for keeping your local chain state in sync with the world state. So broadly speaking, there's 2 categories of behavior. The first being the block propagation manager there. which looks at new blocks as they come on the network. It looks for activity at the head of the chain. It also watches the head as it keeps advancing, so you can figure out where you want to go. And the second bit is the downloader, which is responsible for getting all the historical data onto your node. So say for example, you were a brand new node entering the network, you would be at 0, and the head of the chain is 8 million something, I believe, at present. So its job is to get you from 0 all the way up to 8 million. So one thing to note here is that the downloader's responsibility is to get you from 0 to 8 million something, and after that, to keep you in sync with things as the chain progresses, it's the VPN that takes over. Okay, so then, alright, so then we'll look at full.
How does it work out what the cutoff is? Like, like for the downloader, say when we're up to say block 1,000, how does it work out what should be downloaded as opposed to the block propagation manager and does it mean that you're going to tell us?
Yeah, I'll get into that in a second.
Yeah. Okay.
So the talk for today is very much dealing with just for the download, but we'll touch on that.
Yeah.
Alright, so before we get into the guts of how Fastsync works, I'll do a quick sort of segue into how things work at the low level. So basically how a state goes from one transition, from one state to the next. So we'll start off with the state tree which is pretty much a snapshot of the network at any given moment in time, block 1000 in this case. Along comes a miner with a bunch of transactions. What then happens is these transactions are then applied to that state at block 1000, which then transitions it to a new state at block 1001. This is classified, or this is called the state transition process, and is one of the things that the yellow paper describes. As a result of this, we also have a bunch of artifacts, and the biggest one in question is the transaction receipts tree. So as each transaction gets added and it's validated, we create a receipt for each, and then we put them into the state tree, and then we validate that the root of that matches the hash in the header. Right, so now we take the thing to note that this process is fairly intensive in terms of computation as well as time. So if you were to start from log 0 and work your way all the way up to 8 million something, that takes about a little bit over a month, working continuously depending on what resources you have. So we'll first talk about Fastsync, and then we'll look to contrast and compare that to Fastsync. Right, so the very first thing that we see when a node comes onto the network is, now we talk about it as a blockchain, but it would be helpful to recognize that when the node comes on, it doesn't see a chain per se, it sees a whole tree. And this is because there's canonical blocks, there's non-canonical blocks, there's forks, and you kind of have to be able to deal with that. So the first step in this process is to wait for peers to connect. So peers being the little green blobs all around the place. And obviously the more peers that we have connected to us, the more accurate our view of the network is. So once we've gotten that point, we then get some information back from each node. So what do we get? So the first thing we get is what the node believes to be the current chain head. It tells us what its genesis block is. It also tells us what network it's on. I'll touch on the network in a second, but the other messages, so as the chain advances and new blocks are put on, it also sends us messages about those, so new block hashes. So these are helpful to note when you're syncing, per se. You can figure out where this node's chain is, and then you can estimate where it's advancing, and then you can estimate where you'd like to get to after that. So the network ID for Ethereum and for Ethereum Classic is, they both share the same network ID, but the way you distinguish which network you're trying to go, which one you're trying to connect to, is by the block numbers. So the bit on the right hand side is meant to represent Ethereum Classic. So this has higher block numbers, but it has lower difficulty. And mainstream Ethereum has lower block numbers but high difficulty. So when you trying to connect to one, we generally care about only the Ethereum. At that point, you can also ask for additional information at the data block. I'll get onto that in a bit. Right, so once we've selected our best peer, one on the top, which has the heaviest chain head, which is by definition the most amount of work done to it, and then that's the one that we know about from all the peers that connect. We then select that as our best peer, and we collapse this entire tree down to a single chain. So now that we've defined the chain as a single thing we can get, we then pick the upper and lower bounds. The lower bound is typically the genesis block for a brand new node that's entering the network. So say if you maybe started the process up and then the node failed, something happened, and then you restarted it, your lower bound becomes the highest block number that's common to both you as well as your best peer that you are now connected to. And then you work your way upwards from there to the head of the chain. Okay, so then once we've defined that, we then query our best peer for a sequence of checkpoint headers, which are essentially smaller segments of the chain that we can parallelize and request data to. So then once we've defined these segments, we then basically send these off to the network get data back for each hash. And because we have the checkpoints from a single chain and we have the hashes, we can always guarantee that the data that we're getting back is relevant for this chain and it's not just random pieces of information that we're getting. So what do requests look like? So the first thing we get is request headers, and in Fastsync we validate every single header as it's received. We then get request bodies, we validate homers, and then as we're working through each of the transactions within the body of the block, we get the transaction receipts as well as generate state data. And as we've worked our way through the entire lot, we've wound up with a state route as well as a transactions receipt route. And then we can validate these hashes with the headers that we've got from there. Okay, so now we'll go on to Fastsync. So this works very similar to the other process. So the node comes onto the network and it waits for peers to connect. One key difference with Fastsync is that you must have a minimum of 5 nodes connected to you before you can start the process up, whereas with Fastsync you could start off with as little as 1. The reason for that is when you're downloading every block, it's not too difficult to adapt and change which way you're going because you're getting everything. Whereas with Fastsync you have to be sure that if something breaks, you need to be going in the same direction and not going off in some tangent. Alright, so the first step is to essentially pick a pivot block. So this is essentially the point where we switch from Fastsync and go into Fastsync. So why do we pick a pivot block someplace behind the head of the chain and not the chain head itself? So there's a couple of reasons for that. So first being so that we can handle chain reorgs. So when chain reorgs happen, if they happen before the pivot block, that's in something that's in practice that the client will not tolerate, and this gives us the ability to handle and cater for things like that. The second reason is that once we switch to Fastsync, we want to validate every block after that point to build confidence that as we add additional proof of work to each block, our chain is in fact true. So as before, we ask for peers to connect and give us their chain head. We then pick a pivot block based on a configurable parameter. So let's say if the chain head was at 8,001,000 and our pivot block number was at 1,000, our pivot block then becomes 8 million. So then we query all our peers and we ask them, what block do you have with 8 million? So a whole bunch of responses come back, and then we do a tally and then we work out which direction we want to go. So in practice, you generally don't have 2 blocks with the same numbers. They're always going to be unique. This is just an illustration for maybe it was on a fork and you just so happen to pick a different peer that returned the same block number. And that's why you get the one on the side there. But generally when you pick a chain or a path that you want to proceed down, you pick one that has sufficient support. By sufficient I mean that the majority of peers that you connected to initially all agree that 8 million is in fact 8 million, so basically the same block. You then work like before, you pick the best peer, which is the one on top, and you make sure that the best peer agrees that that is in fact block 8 million, and so it's on the same path. And then very much like earlier, we collapse the entire tree down to a single chain. Then we get our common ancestors as before, which in this case is the genesis block. Then we request for a sequence of checkpoint headers, very much like before. Get the checkpoint headers and then farm out requests to our peers to get the data back. So the key bit here is in the way that we handle the requests and the data that comes back from it. So with the headers, we only validate some of them. We don't validate every single thing like we do with Fastsync. We only validate some proof of works for some blocks, not every single thing. With the request bodies, we don't go through the entire list of transactions as it comes through. We skip all of that. We don't do the transaction receipts, state trees, roots, none of that. We just download them straight off the network. And for transaction receipts, we just download them. We don't calculate anything over there. So essentially, a large part of the computation that you had, time, all of that is no longer present. So basically, we wind up with something like this for a Fastsync down to something like this for Fastsync, where you've just got the state tree, you download the transaction receipts, and you've got the list of transactions over there. Alright, so now we move on to world state. So one very important thing to note is that world state, up until the pivot block, is never calculated or processed. It's only done from that point upwards. So what we do is before we start processing this, another thing is the chain download as well as the world state happen in parallel. I've just put this in sequence over here. So we get, the reason that we're getting this is so that we can process transactions from this point on when we switch to Fastsync. And in order to be able to process transactions, we need the world state, and that's why we download this. So basically, we get the header from the state root hash, the pivot block headers. This in turn returns the root node of the world state tree. We then, which in turn has a bunch of hashes in it, which we then farm out again to get more data, all up the network. So the way that we store this is with a data structure called a hex-tree Patricia Merkle tree, which is essentially a tree where each node is a prefix, corresponds to a key prefix. So it's very easy for you to keep walking down this tree, and eventually you will consume the entire key because that's what the hash equates to. Okay. So at a high level, this is what the account state tree looks like. So go back to the previous slide. The hash over here represents the world state tree or the account state, which is the big blob on the left-hand side over there. So the account state tree is pretty much a mapping between account address and an account tuple. So the account tuple consists of nonce, balance, state tree roots, and code hashes. Now on the Ethereum network, you've got two kinds of accounts. You've got externally owned accounts as well as contract accounts. So externally owned accounts are the ones we use with the likes of MetaMask, things like that. And they don't have any data for the state tree root as well as the code hash. Contract tree accounts do have them. So they have a hash, and that corresponds to the code that you get from your nodes and other peers. And similarly for the storage tree root. Now when you start to download the world state, you essentially go down the tree and you walk down the thing. So leaf nodes, as well as everything inside there, you just keep walking down the tree and you farm out requests to the network to get data back in exactly the same manner. Nothing really is too different in that process. So this is some of the limitations of Fastsync. So when we talk about Fastsync, the first big limitation is that the security guarantees are not as strong, and this is because there is a trade-off between speed and bandwidth. So when you do a Fastsync to get to the header chain, this takes about 12 to 15 hours, give or take. So there's a massive benefit in doing a Fastsync to get you up to speed as well as, and you do a full sync. Another thing is because of the way the Fastsync process works, it fetches state entries on a one by one basis. So effectively, if you have to get leaf data at the end, you've actually got to go through this entire tree until you've worked out what everything is and you download the entire thing. So to get all this, it's quite network intensive because there's a lot of requests going back and forth. And it would be simpler if you could just get the leaf data and then work your way backwards to build up the state tree. And another drawback is that when we send out requests to the network and to peers, we're essentially giving them random hashes. There's no way to optimize the lookups that they return. Will be quick, or there's no real way to optimize that. Okay, so a brief chat about some of the other sync algorithms that we have. So the first one that we have is becoming very popular in today is LightSync. So this is essentially a mechanism where you can download world state sort of on demand, and you pick where you want to get. So for example, the use case is your mobile client or browser or something like a Raspberry Pi, very low power device, but you don't really need everything to have to get going. You basically want to check balances or do light kind of stuff. So essentially you say, give me the current state, which just gives you that particular point and doesn't have any historical data. So as a consequence of that, when you actually start to do queries and lookups and things, they take additional time because they've actually got to go to archive nodes, fetch the data that they want, and then work their way backwards. So even the smallest operation can take a bit of time. But there is a trade-off that is there. And the second drawback is it assumes that everything on the network is honest. Not quite always the case, but so some of the new clients are working around this. So what they do is they put in trusted checkpoints into the clients. So you may not, so when you start off, you may not be 100% of the way that you know where you're going, but you're pretty sure that the way you want to go, because of these trusted markers that you kind of have on the tree, are the right way. Okay, so the other one is something that comes out of Parity called Fastsync, where this leverages off some of the drawbacks that I've touched on in Fastsync, where you go down and download everything. So what they do is they wrap up leaf state as well as the world state as a whole, wrap it up into one big blob, snapshot it, and then you download that. And then what you do is you take that data, uncompress it, get the leaf nodes, and then work your way to calculating the world state based on multiple proofs. So the biggest drawback with this is that because of the way the network is and the way you are downloading these things is you're essentially saying, give me a big blob of data from one single node. So you can essentially trick that node into downloading a piece of rubbish data or just a giant blob of rubbish. But the only way the node will work out that it's rubbish is when it's actually uncompressed, done all the calculations, gone through everything, worked out the state root hash, and then finds, hang on, these don't match. So all that work has to just be thrown away and you start all over again. And the second drawback is building these snapshots is extremely expensive. Right, so one of the last bigger ones, which is still in development, is called Fastsync, which builds kind of on the best of both worlds between Parity's hybrid warp as well as LeafSync. So it aims to basically break the large requests, break them into smaller, more manageable sized chunks, assuming of course that your peers can handle and give you the smaller chunks without any big dramas there. But basically you get the leaf data from the smaller chunks, and then you incrementally validate them with multiple proofs and slowly build up your tree and then work your way backwards from that point. It's also aiming at giving you hints. So say you request a world state or a root node that's not quite valid, it will hint and say, we don't actually have this, but maybe you meant this instead. And then you kind of get helpful hints all along the way to get you down a lot faster. So it puts a little bit more intelligence into the way it works. So this is still in development, not quite there yet. And it has the same drawback as before because it's downloading snapshots. Those are a bit intensive. So this is some more snapshots, some more links that we have with some of the other major algorithms out there. I'll put links in there for you to have a quick look at if you want. I think that pretty much wraps this up. Yep. So, questions? Oh, one more disclaimer. A lot of these slides were taken from a colleague of mine. So I'm very indebted to her for that, Meredith Baxter from the US. Yeah.
So, what questions does anyone have any questions?
You mentioned it takes a month or something too.
So a full sync. So if you've got a reasonably beefy machine and you're trying to sync every single block, it takes roughly about a month.
So, is that month, if you have the data actually on disk rather than having to get it across the network? So I always thought it was the network connection.
It is
not
the
the month.
So the month is you're starting with completely blank. You've got no data at all,
Yeah.
and you've actually got to sync everything in there.
But if the data was on a hard disk and all you needed to do was process it, how long would it take?
It'll be a lot faster than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is assuming that you're in a brand new network. You've got no data at all. You're just one node that's connecting to the network. Worst possible case, I guess.
Yeah.
Example you gave sounds more like Fastsync, where you basically said download all the data. So once you've got that data, then the processing stuff.
Yeah, but say if you had an Ethereum node say you've got a data center and you've got an Ethereum node that's in, say, the same rack, so we're in the same rack as the computer that you want to, and you can somehow either get it to sync off that one, so it's a local area network on the same fiber backbone and whatever.
It'll be a lot faster, but it'll still take a while because it actually has to go and validate each transaction and build up. So that part you can't fake. You still have to work through, validate, get your root hashes, and then compare them. So that's time consuming, but it'll definitely possibly a few days from a month.
Yeah.
Okay. Also for Fastsync, you don't actually download a lot of the world state, you create it.
Yeah. So that's
You've got to do the computation at the end of the day for a Fastsync. You don't shortcut any of that world state.
And you presume your world state is accurate to the world state at the completion, or is there another hash or checksum or something like that to another node after that event? So with the full sync, you're pulling the stuff down, doing the checking, and you're populating your world state as you go.
You're checking at each block.
Yeah. So at the end, there's no further validation. It's assumed because you've been on that journey that you're going to come up with the same world state as every other node. Or is there another
Pretty
check?
much, yeah. So basically, the first diagram where I had the block propagation managers with the downloader.
Yeah.
So the downloader gets you up to at that point where you've connected to, and as you've advanced from that point, you'll then switch over, and then your head then doesn't become that node; it's the next block, whatever it is, until you've agreed that, or at least you agree that multiple nodes agree that this is in fact the chain head. And then as new blocks get processed by miners, that get propagated out, and then you've got a new block, so you go and do that. And it's just rinse and repeat.
So one of the things that's been discussed with Ethereum 1.x is state rent and essentially archiving contracts and such like when they run out of money. And I'm just trying to think, given your description, how will that help? Because surely you have to go through all the history and then you go, then it ran out of money, so I couldn't pay rent. So that's going to have the active tree of data that needs to be held will be smaller, but you'll still have to sync all that.
Yeah, you still have to sync that, or the option is to say that I don't actually have this data. I'll go and connect to an archive node that has this data, get the data off them, bring it back on, and then I can work from there.
What is the total amount of data currently on mainnet?
No idea.
1.5 terabyte?
Yeah, it's a big chunk.
And what is I'm still need to hear you, so some of the what. Back in the old days of Maven, we used to say that it is downloading the internet. So if you're on a very big project and you have a huge amount of libraries and everything like in worth of GB, so we used to do stuck in our USB stick, copy everything and then give it to the other developer rather than him downloading everything again. So I wonder whether it would be faster to actually snapshot of the hard disk and give it to your company member to start from there.
You can kind of do that. So in the sense that say maybe you want to spin up 5 devices or 5 nodes on your on-prem data center, whatever. What you can do is you start off with one and you let that come to maybe pretty close to the chain head, and then you take a snapshot of that disk, and you can in fact go and pass this on to other nodes. You have to make a new block volume per se for each one of them. But then when they fire up, then they go, oh hang on, I've actually got. data at this point, and then it works to, so if I go back to the lower bound, so the lower bound then becomes your,
Your current head.
yeah, so it'll be the head of that, and then you don't basically do a fast sync, you just switch into full sync and go, I'm here, the next block is 15, 20 blocks, whatever it is. I'll just get those and I'll continue with doing this as full sync. So once you've got to that point and you say you're in sync, you don't go into doing fast sync up there. It's always a full sync from the point that you've gone fast to full. So this one, right?
I've got a question. Fastsync, why do you choose to block halfway up and not just as high as you can go in the chain? So that would be what, 7 or 8 blocks behind the chain head.
In that diagram it was 7 or 8, but in reality it's probably more like 100 to 1,000. The reason is, say when you still allow for chain reorgs for one, so when things suddenly go diversion,
But you shouldn't get a chain reorg.
not that far behind in the black. But if you go 7, you could technically get some reorgs, and then you've kind of got to start all over again. But if you're 1,000 blocks behind, you voluntarily established that there's no way there's a reorg going to happen at this point.
Or not on mainnet.
Oh, no, not your hope, not
You're on
it,
the classic.
yeah, it's kept possible.
Sorry, it's also configurable, isn't it? How far
Yeah,
behind
it
you're
is.
happy to go.
Yeah, it is a parameter that you specify. So if you really wanted to, you could go to 7, but it's not recommended that you do it. So generally, so when you accept a transaction as being valid, you generally wait until it's done 4 or 5 blocks after that, and then you say, oh yeah, this transaction is in fact valid, and then I'll keep going ahead. It's pretty much the same reason. You don't trust it to be in a state of being permanent. It's still in a state of flux if you get too far off chain.
Yeah, probabilistic finality.
Exactly.
Okay. Maybe you should flip to the very last slide and then I can talk about what's coming up. Yes, that's it. Okay, so things are happening. So we've got around about 90 people coming to the event on Monday, or heading towards 90. I think we're about 87 or something. So I haven't booked in very in the last few hours. So we're probably up to 90 by now, which is absolutely fabulous. This may be the largest blockchain event in Brisbane so far. I think there may have been an event a few years ago that was free that had 200 people at it. But anyway, for paid events, this will be it. It's going to be fabulous. Real world applications of blockchain, and how it actually applies. So I think it's pretty cool. And yep, going to be fabulous. And the food's going to be great too. That's it. Anyway, there's a story in that. Yeah. So then in 2 weeks' time, Brett, who is just there, is going to tell us the latest on Ethereum 2 and where we're up to, where we're going, and explain it all to us. Make it so that we can all understand.
Yes, he will.
Well,
He's got some reading to do in the next week.
Yeah. And then we've got the Enterprise Ethereum Client Specification 3.0. So that's actually been standardized in May, and Grant Noble is going to tell us about that, possibly with help. But anyway, so that's going to happen. That's going to be really cool to hear what we're actually up to and where we're going with 4.0. What are we trying to standardize for, essentially, Ethereum in a private enterprise environment. And then I'm going to talk all about sidechain pinning and pegging. So essentially, if you've got a sidechain, a private blockchain, how can you stop state reversion using pinning? What are the techniques you could use to actually hold the state of that sidechain on mainnet or some other chain that you're using as a main chain? And what it can give you, and what are the possible approaches? So hope to see you at all of those. It's going to be great. And so anyway, so Joshua, are there any more questions for Josh?
Good presentation.
Oh no, we've got one last one. Let's hold off our clapping.
Sorry. Just a comment that you made about reorgs, or Joshua made about reorgs, but you mentioned something like classic There
Oh.
was more.
So Ethereum Classic doesn't have the hashing power, and so Ethereum mainnet is a proof of work chain, as is Classic, and so Ethereum Classic, there was the DAO hack, or DAO, essentially a re-entrancy vulnerability in some Solidity code. I think it was 68 million or something like that US dollars was stolen from a contract back in 2016, and so to get around that, a non-sequential update essentially to the blockchain occurred, which essentially put the value back into the original accounts and took it from the account that had stolen it. And so the Ethereum clients which did the update to allow that to happen stayed on mainnet, and the people who said, no, this is not fair, you cannot change, you know, it's happened, 68 million's blown, that's life, you know, contracts, you know, what is it, code is law and all that sort of business. So they ended up being Ethereum Classic, and then you've got normal Ethereum. So Ethereum Classic, they've got a much less hashing power, and so the security that you're getting out of Ethereum is, you know, your probabilistic finality depends a lot on who you see as your adversary. And so if you look at the moment with the hashing power you've got on Ethereum mainnet, you would need to spend, I think it's $300,000 to get enough hashing power to do only 5% of the overall hashing power for 1 hour. So you can rent out, you know, that sort of hashing power. You can't rent out more than that because it just doesn't exist to rent, that is. So with that amount of money, you could, you know, like rent out enough to do 5%. So with 5%, you could think, all right, well, I've now got a 5% of minting the next block, mining the next block. And so say if you produced that block, and then you can then have a 1 in 5%, so 1 in 20 chance for the next block, and the next, and the next, and the next. So you say you wanted to get to 12 blocks in a row that, you know, you had produced, then you've got to go 1 on 20, you know, to the 12. So it's pretty small probability. On the other hand, if you've got a low hashing power chain, such as Ethereum Classic, you can rent out probably more than 100% of the hashing power if, you know, if you wanted to put that much money into it. And in fact, someone did. And they caused massive, you know, many hundreds or maybe even thousands of block reorg on Ethereum Classic. And so what that means is you could do double spends and all that sort of thing. So essentially what it would mean is you could start 1,000 blocks ago, and then even though those 1,000 blocks might have taken a couple of days or weeks to produce, you can say, well, if I can do 100% hashing power, then I can produce, or say 200% would be good, 200% hashing power. So I'm likely to produce blocks twice as quickly as you can. So I could start, say, 2 days ago, and then in about a day and a half's time, you know, I'll have caught up to you approximately, and then I can overtake you. So then I could change some of the history and then rewrite history. And so that's why on a low hashing power blockchain, such as Ethereum Classic, you know, it's all up for grabs. You know, if you've got a motivated enough attacker, they will be able to take out the chain. Bitcoin and Ethereum mainnet, you would need a silly amount of money. I think to get to a reasonable amount of hashing power to take on the network, you need to invest about $300 to $500 million. And also you're going to have to put a pretty big order in to, I think it's Radon or something like that, to, you know, for GPUs. And if you do that, I think people will notice that you've put in a $500 million order and you've started to build a data center, probably gone off and bought a power station too, maybe. Or maybe bulk buy some power. Yeah.
Fairly intensive at that point.
Yeah, so for Ethereum mainnet and Bitcoin, these sorts of long reorgs are very unlikely. But yeah, for Ethereum Classic and other smaller chains, it's fine. Does that explain that? Okay. All right, anyway, so Josh, thank you very much for doing the talk. And Josh has only been with us for how many weeks?
4 or 5 at best.
So he must have done an all-time record for starting work and then presenting something at the meetup. So congratulations, thank you.
Just last year, precinct.
It's all right.
Yeah, this year went great.
Peter?